The morning sun rose over the Solomon Islands, quiet and blinding. Somewhere high above the clouds, a man who had changed the course of history was about to meet his end. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, the Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the architect behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was Japan's brightest strategist, a man both feared and respected, and for the United States he was the symbol of everything they had lost on that dark December morning. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that his every move was being watched. Weeks before, in a heavily guarded room in Hawaii, American cryptanalysts had done the impossible. They had broken the Japanese Naval Code, JN-25, one of the most complex encryption systems of the war. Amid thousands of intercepted messages, one stood out. It contained Yamamoto's itinerary, exact flight times, departure points, escort details, and coordinates. It was a golden opportunity, one so precise it almost felt unreal. The U.S. High Command faced a moral dilemma. If they acted, Japan would know their code was broken. But if they didn't, the man responsible for Pearl Harbor would live to plan again. There was no hesitation. President Roosevelt himself approved the mission with a single phrase: "Get Yamamoto." The operation was codenamed Operation Vengeance, a fitting name for what was to come. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 16 American pilots took off from Guadalcanal in P-38 Lightning fighters, long-range interceptors capable of flying over 400 miles of open ocean. Their orders were clear: intercept Yamamoto's plane and bring it down at all costs. They flew in radio silence, low over the waves to avoid detection, guided only by dead reckoning and a compass that wavered in the humidity. Every mile carried the weight of revenge. Each man knew he might not return. After hours in the air, the silence broke. Ahead of them, tiny dots in the distance. Two Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6-0 fighters. One of those bombers carried Admiral Yamamoto. The P-38s climbed fast. The Japanese hadn't seen them yet. For a heartbeat, the sky seemed to hold its breath. Then the ambush began. The first burst of gunfire ripped through the clouds. Tracer rounds streaked the air like red lightning. 1-0 spun downward in flames. Another dove straight into the jungle canopy below. The Americans split their formation, two fighters diving on the bomber while the others engaged the escorts. Captain Thomas Lanfair and Lieutenant Rex Barber locked onto Yamamoto's aircraft. Barber's guns opened first, tearing into the bomber's right engine. Smoke poured out, black and thick. Lanfair circled behind, his gun spitting fire into the fuselage. Yamamoto's plane lurched violently. The left wing sheared off. For a moment, it seemed frozen midair, then it fell nose first into the green jungle below. A dull explosion echoed through the valley. The architect of Pearl Harbor was gone. The second bomber, carrying Yamamoto's staff officers, tried to escape. Barber pursued it through heavy fire, crippling it before it too fell in flames. The Americans turned back, fuel nearly gone, hearts pounding. They had done what no one thought possible. They had reached across hundreds of miles of enemy territory and struck at the heart of Japan's military command. When word of Yamamoto's death reached Tokyo, shock turned to silence. The Emperor's navy had lost its guiding mind, the one man who truly understood both the strengths and weaknesses of Japan's position. Yamamoto had warned his own government years before that a war with the United States would be disastrous. He had famously said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Now the giant had struck back. The Japanese military tried to hide his death at first, reporting it as a temporary disappearance. But soon the truth spread. When Yamamoto's body was recovered from the jungle, he was found still wearing his white gloves. His sword lay beside him untouched. In the U.S., news of the mission was kept secret for months to protect the codebreakers. The men who carried out the ambush couldn't speak of it, not even to their families. But when the story finally broke, they were hailed as heroes, the avengers of Pearl Harbor. In Japan, Yamamoto's death became a national tragedy. To his soldiers, he was more than a commander, he was a symbol of honor, intelligence, and courage. His funeral was held with full military rites. Even his enemies, far across the ocean, respected the man they had killed. But beneath the headlines and medals lay a deeper story, one about fate, intelligence, and the price of vengeance. The Americans had risked everything, not just in battle but in secrecy. Had the Japanese discovered that their codes were broken, the advantage that helped win the Pacific War might have been lost. Operation Vengeance wasn't just a mission, it was a message. A message that even in the vastness of the Pacific, no enemy was untouchable. That the war, however brutal, could still be shaped by precision, patience, and courage. Years later, when surviving pilots were asked what they remembered most, it wasn't triumph, it was silence. The moment the jungle swallowed Yamamoto's plane, they realized something profound. Revenge may have a target, but it also has a cost. They had avenged Pearl Harbor. But in the end, the sky above Bougainville carried no victory parade, only the quiet hum of engines fading into the distance, and the realization that history had just changed forever. The sleeping giant had truly awakened. And that day it made sure its enemy never forgot it. The jungle below was still smoldering hours after the crash. A reconnaissance team from the Japanese Imperial Army trudged through the dense undergrowth of Bougainville, searching for any sign of survivors. The humidity hung heavy, and the air smelled of fuel and burnt metal. Then, through the smoke they found it. The twisted wreckage of the Betty bomber was scattered across the forest floor, torn open by gunfire. Bodies lay among the debris motionless. One officer pushed aside a sheet of metal and froze. There, still seated upright, his hand clutching his sword, was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His face was calm, almost peaceful. 2 bullet wounds marked his chest, a clean, sudden end for the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. For a long moment no one spoke. Even the jungle seemed to go silent, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had just been lost. When the news reached Tokyo, it hit like an earthquake. The Navy tried to suppress it, fearing a collapse in morale. But word spread quickly among sailors and officers: the admiral is dead. In the corridors of power there was disbelief. Yamamoto had been their most brilliant strategist, a man who had studied in the United States, who knew its people, its factories, its resolve. He had warned them before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, America's industrial might would crush them. Now, as the war began to tilt toward the Allies, his warning echoed like prophecy. In the United States, the reaction was quieter, official silence mixed with private satisfaction. Few knew of the mission's details, and fewer still understood the risk the codebreakers had taken. But among the men who had survived Pearl Harbor, the story carried a different weight. It wasn't just revenge. It was closure. Back in Bougainville, Japanese soldiers built a makeshift shrine at the crash site. They wrapped Yamamoto's remains in a white cloth and carried him out of the jungle on their shoulders, their heads bowed. The trail they walked became known as the Yamamoto Path, a sacred ground where soldiers would later come to pay their respects. When his ashes finally reached Tokyo, the entire nation went into mourning. Flags flew at half-mast. Radio stations played somber music. And in every city, citizens lined the streets to honor the admiral who had led them into war, and now, symbolically, led them to face the cost of it. Even American pilots later admitted they felt conflicted. They hadn't killed just a military leader. They'd ended a man who, ironically, had once fought to avoid war with them. Yamamoto had lived and died by a strict code of honor. And though he commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, he had done so out of duty, not hatred. As his funeral pyre burned, Japan's fate was already shifting. The tide of war was turning. The U.S. island-hopping campaign was gaining ground, and the Imperial Navy, once unstoppable, began to crumble. Each carrier lost, each base bombed, seemed to echo with Yamamoto's absence. In Washington, General MacArthur's staff quietly noted that the psychological blow of Yamamoto's death was as significant as any battlefield victory. The man who had unified Japan's naval spirit was gone, and with him its confidence. Years later, one of the American pilots, Rex Barber, returned to Bougainville. The jungle had swallowed the wreckage long ago, but fragments of the plane still lay rusting beneath the vines. He stood there in silence, the humidity thick, the air heavy with memory. He said later that he didn't feel triumph, only the weight of history. Because wars, he realized, aren't defined by who shoots first or who shoots last. They're defined by the people left behind, the choices, the secrets, and the quiet moments that never make it into the headlines. Operation Vengeance was a perfect strike, executed with precision, guided by intelligence, and wrapped in secrecy. But it was also a reflection of something deeper. It showed how fragile leadership could be, how a single intercepted message could change the entire direction of a war. For the Japanese Navy, Yamamoto's death was more than a loss. It was a wound that would never truly heal. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral, Japan's highest military rank. His ashes were divided, half interred at Tokyo's Tama Cemetery, and the rest returned to his hometown of Nagaoka, where cherry blossoms bloom each spring. Visitors still come there today. Some to honor a warrior, others to remember a man who foresaw his country's destruction long before it began. And deep in the jungles of Bougainville, where the trees have grown over the wreckage, the silence remains. It's as if the earth itself refuses to forget the day the skies burned with vengeance. The day history caught up with the architect of Pearl Harbor. The mission was over. But its shadow would linger, a reminder that in war even the victors carry ghosts. The story didn't end with the crash. Across the Pacific, military analysts pored over the results. Every report, every intercepted communication, was studied meticulously. The Americans realized they had not only removed a brilliant strategist, but also sent a message. No enemy, no matter how careful, was untouchable. In Japan, morale wavered. Officers who had once moved confidently under Yamamoto's command now hesitated. Plans stalled. Decisions were second-guessed. The loss of one man, even one of his genius, had ripple effects far beyond the battlefield. Meanwhile, the pilots who executed the mission returned to their squadrons, still high above the ocean. They had flown hundreds of miles into enemy territory with no margin for error, relying solely on calculations, intelligence, and nerves of steel. Each engine roar, each gust of wind, every wave below was a silent threat. But they had succeeded. Every shot fired, every maneuver executed, had been precise, a dance with fate. Back in the jungles of Bougainville, local guides and scouts walked the crash site in the following days. They marked the ground, cleared debris, and documented what had occurred. Even years later, their accounts would provide historians with the clarity needed to reconstruct those final minutes in the sky. Yamamoto's death was not merely a tactical win. It changed how the Pacific War was fought. Without his leadership, Japanese naval operations lost coordination, and the Allies were able to exploit weaknesses in supply lines, fleet movements, and defensive strategies. Every island captured, every airfield secured, carried the invisible imprint of a mission that had begun months earlier with intercepted messages and silent planes crossing the dawn-lit horizon. In Washington, the success of Operation Vengeance was celebrated quietly. Intelligence officers knew the stakes. Breaking codes and striking at a commander's heart was a double-edged sword. Victory came at the cost of exposing that the Japanese code had been compromised. Yet the gamble paid off. History would remember the mission as one of the most daring and effective precision strikes in military history. For the pilots, however, it was not glory they carried back. It was the memory of seeing history unfold from the cockpit. They had flown straight into the heart of the enemy strategy and emerged with the weight of a world-changing act on their shoulders. Some kept journals. Some kept silent. But all understood the significance. A single mission, a handful of men, and a single target could shift the tide of war. In Japan, Yamamoto became a symbol, not just of military genius but of what was lost when a leader falls. His warnings, his strategies, his careful planning, all ended abruptly in a jungle on a quiet April morning. The reverberations of his death would shape battles, alter morale, and accelerate the eventual surrender of the Japanese Empire. Decades later, historians would call Operation Vengeance one of the most audacious targeted strikes in modern warfare. A mission executed with precision, courage, and intelligence, proving that even the most formidable adversaries could be challenged with strategy, not just force. The P-38s returned to base. Fuel tanks nearly empty. Exhausted yet triumphant. The pilots disembarked, knowing the world would never fully understand the risk they had taken, the precision required, or the human cost of their mission. They had delivered vengeance, yes, but also history itself, a lesson in intelligence, courage, and the fragile power of one man in the tides of war. The Pacific would never be the same. And in the skies, over islands and oceans, the story of that morning, the ambush that killed Yamamoto, would echo forever.